The last vodcast you watched on biodiversity ended on this slide with protecting biodiversity, which you looked at some of the different programs that are developed in order to make sure that species stay safe, whether that's setting aside land or keeping the reproductive cells of the species safe, or actually keeping the actual animals safe or the plants themselves safe. In this podcast, we're going to move on to what entire states or countries or coalitions of countries can do to maintain biodiversity, to keep those organisms safe. So we call this public policy. These are decisions that governments make that can affect the biodiversity of the areas that they're governing. The most famous kind of government policy on biodiversity in the United States is the Endangered Species Act, which was first passed in 1973. I'm going to go over a little bit of information about the Endangered Species Act itself, what it actually says, talk about what endangered species are, and give some examples of some historical endangered species. So first of all, the Endangered Species Act is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Act itself says that this organization has to keep a list of all endangered and threatened species. I think most people are familiar with the Endangered Species List. You've probably heard about it at some point or another, but maybe you didn't know that it's actually the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a federal agency that actually keeps that list going, decide what's going to be on it and what's going to be taken off. The Endangered Species Act also says that these species that are on the list cannot be caught, killed, uprooted, sold, or traded. So not only does it have to do with killing these species, but also the distribution of the species, so selling or trading them. Third, the Endangered Species Act says that the federal government may not carry out a project that jeopardizes endangered species. In other words, if the federal government wants to build a building somewhere, and there happens to be an endangered species living in that area, or an endangered species that relies on that area for some resource, the federal government cannot build that building there. So any project that taxpayer dollars are supporting cannot put an endangered species at risk. And then finally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that's the USFWS, has to make a plan for each of the species on the list. So what are we going to do to try to get those species to start coming back, to increase that biodiversity? All right, what is an endangered species? The word for an endangered species is a little bit of a gray area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to kind of do studies and decide what's going on with different populations of organisms. But basically, the idea is that these are species whose numbers have gotten so low that is close to extinction. And what that means for different species could be different things. But basically, within our lifetime, that species has the possibility of becoming extinct. And that's the definition of an endangered species. We also keep a close eye on species that we consider threatened. So this is kind of a lower level of an endangered species. These are ones that are likely to become endangered if we don't protect them in some way. Oftentimes we'll protect habitats and things like that for these threatened species so that they don't get to be destroyed in so high amounts that they actually are going to be endangered. So we have different tiers kind of how worried we are about different organisms. Some probably famous endangered species that you are familiar with or maybe heard of. I think just about everybody knows that at one point the bald eagle was on the endangered species list for the United States. It is no longer on the endangered species list because those numbers have recovered. California condor was another famous one. American bison, still on the endangered species list. And gray wolves and red wolves are on endangered species lists in some states. Now, there's a little bit of a difference here that I briefly need to describe. The United States, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the United States government does keep its own endangered species list. But then each state also makes a list of things that are endangered just in their state or their area. I think you're probably familiar with the idea that the gray wolves are a big species of discussion in Minnesota. We have had the gray wolves on our endangered species list in the past, but they are no longer considered endangered because their numbers came back. And by our endangered species list, I mean here in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, they've been on the endangered species list. Their numbers have come back, and this year they were actually had a hunting season for gray wolves in Minnesota. Wisconsin, on the other hand, has not had them on the endangered species list as recently, and have had a hunting season for gray wolves more often than we have. So this can vary by state to state. The area of Yellowstone, for example, still protects gray wolves. So as a country, we may not have gray wolves on the endangered species list, but in a particular state, you might. The bald eagle was on the endangered species list for the entire country. Okay, so it was on the United States endangered species list. So hopefully that makes sense. So not all of them have to be endangered in all of the states, because some states have higher numbers of certain species than others. A little bit more on governments and how they can help to control biodiversity. Different governments do work together globally, so they kind of pair up together and try to meet a common goal that they have for biodiversity. So some international organizations that work to help with biodiversity are the World Wildlife Fund. This one is the one that has a little symbol of a panda. You've maybe seen commercials for this one before. Number 2, the Nature Conservancy. 3, Conservation International. 4, Friends of the Earth. And 5, Greenpeace. And again, you've maybe heard of some of these, but might not be completely familiar with what they do and how they actually help to promote biodiversity. They're huge organizations. As I said, they're global organizations, people in many different countries coming together to work on common goals. What you're going to be doing in an assignment when you get back to class is you're going to be looking up each of these different global organizations. You're going to be finding what's called their mission statement, or kind of their main goal of what they do on their websites. And then you're going to search their website to figure out what they do specifically to address biodiversity. Because the World Wildlife Fund, for example, has a lot of different things that it's trying to accomplish. Okay, in its mission statement, you're going to see there are a lot of different pieces to what it wants to do. So I want you to go and find specifically what is it trying to accomplish, looking at just biodiversity. So what is it doing to help improve biodiversity on the planet? So for each of these, I want you to be very specific in this biodiversity category. As I said, you'll be doing this in class a little bit later so that you can learn more about these global organizations. All right, the last thing on public policy is that international governments have also gotten together. And they have made some laws, I guess you could say. They aren't laws that governments have to follow. They're more like guidelines regarding biodiversity. The first one is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, easier to say IUCN. And what they've done is gotten together a whole bunch of governments and organizations to work on biodiversity issues. So they'll meet every once in a while and talk about what different governments are doing and how they can help each other out. One of the things that they passed as a IUCN is a treaty that has to do with endangered species. So all these governments of the IUCN got together and they put together this international convention on trade in endangered species. And the treaty they came up with had to do with poaching. So all of these governments could come together and agree that they wanted to limit poaching within their borders. Also, there was an Earth Summit in Brazil in 1992 that addressed biodiversity as well. And there they also made another treaty, whereas the wealthier countries agreed they could give money to the poorer countries to help protect species. And that's because oftentimes the places where we have the poorest countries are the ones where we see a lot of destruction of habitat, because the people need to clear that land and use it to help provide food or money for themselves. And so in order to get around that clearing of land and thereby destruction of species, there was some discussion of paying these poorer countries to protect that land. Now again, these are not binding laws, so there's nothing that says that wealthy countries have to do this. It's just more guidelines. But again, it points out kind of the importance of, instead of always just going for one species like we have to protect the bald eagle, maybe we can look at protecting large areas of land that have many species in them that would take care of lots of different problems at once.